Okay, we'll get started. Good evening. It's Tuesday, October 12th, 2021. This is a regular meeting of the Policy and Services Committee. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Yes, Ms. Chair. Committee Member Stone,
Here.
Committee Member Tanaka, Chair Koo.
Here, thank you.
For the record, we have 2 present.
Very good. So we'll start off with oral communications. Could you please help me with that?
Yes, ma'am. If anyone wants to make a public comment on agenda items that are not on the agenda, please use the raise your hand function now or press *9. And through the chair, we don't have any members of the public present. So.
Very good. Thank you so much. In that case, we'll go on to our action items. Item number 1 is review and approve a task order for the Office of the City Auditor to conduct a utility work order process and accounting review. Do you have
Great. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Good evening, members of the Policy and Services Committee. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. I have one PowerPoint presentation for all 3 items that are on the agenda. So this is the first time you'll see the introduction, but we'll obviously pause as we go through. The first item today is indeed the utility work order and accounting review. As you may recall, this was one of the many projects that were approved as part of the audit plan. We'll go over the update on the full audit plan as we get further in the evening tonight. But this was a phase 2 activity that we're looking for approval tonight. So the utility work order and accounting review is identified as a priority during the risk assessment process that was completed roughly 10 months ago. You can see our audit objectives. We want to conduct an initial assessment to identify high-risk process areas. Then we want to document and evaluate those process areas and controls. And we also want to perform some sample-based testing to identify any potential compliance issues and or misrecording of time to work orders. So it's a high-level overview. Ultimately, the utility work order process is a significant component of how the utilities operate. Anytime somebody goes out in the field and performs labor, they attribute their time to an asset. And ultimately, that's how rates are developed. That's how you determine the asset values of your assets. So a lot is built into the work order process, hence its identification during the risk assessment process. So you have the actual task order in your packet. But ultimately, what we're seeking is for your all's approval for us to forward this to City Council for consent and begin the work in the next 3 to 4 weeks.
Shall we go to the public for comments?
Okay, if any member of the public wants to make a comment, please raise your hand now. I don't see any members who would like to make a comment, Chair.
Okay, very good. We'll return to the committee. Any council member? Councilmember Stone.
Thanks, Chair Koo. I'm Mr. O'Rourke. Good to see you. Thanks for being here tonight. Couple questions. First, on the interviews that are planned to being conducted, are those going to be in person, on the phone, in Zoom? I mean, I did see that you're planning on being on site. Is that when all the interviews are going to be conducted?
We're planning to conduct many, if not all, the interviews remotely.
Okay.
Those interviews will be with management, folks in finance, as well as people that kind of work in the field. So kind of across the board to get a sampling of all the parties involved.
So what are the advantages for the on-site field work compared to doing doing everything virtually?
On-site would be helpful if we needed to do, if the process were manual, we needed to do sort of a oversight of how the process works in person, or alternatively, if the systems are complex, it could be beneficial for us to be in person. Hypothetically, if the processes for documenting time in the field were complicated, it could be beneficial to see those as well, although I don't anticipate that will be the case.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. And then I guess this is for, well, for whomever wants to answer this question. As far as when we have these type of visits where staff is then staying staying in a hotel that gets reimbursed by the city, is there some sort of requirement that those stays being done with it at Palo Alto hotels to ensure that we get the, that we're able to kind of help out our own and get some of those TOT taxes back?
I'll go first, and anybody else can feel free to chime in. I don't know that there's a specific requirement. However, I personally do stay at one of the Marriott hotels that's in the city. So you have my personal guarantee that I will be staying as close as possible to City Hall.
Perfect. It's a nice hotel too, so very good. And my last question, at least on this item, the scope of services says that you're going to compare the process and controls against the best practices. Are the best practices like industry standard best practices, or are you comparing that to practices with another municipality that's kind of deemed to be a model version?
I would say industry best practice. But ultimately, the folks that we've assigned to this project work in the electric utility and water, wastewater utility industry. And our project manager, her name's Amanda, she has 15 to 20 years of experience specifically with utilities. So I would say she has a broad expertise with other municipal governments as well as just broader public utilities. So we'll use the industry standards as the benchmark to compare to, but we're well aware of some of the processes at sort of similar like entities.
Okay, that's helpful. I appreciate it, and those are all my questions for this item.
Thank you, Councilmember Stone. Councilmember Tanaka, do you have any questions?
Actually, I do. First question is, I look at the agenda, and the agenda has 7 p.m. as the start time. Is that the start time, or was it earlier?
7 p.m. It's 7 p.m.
What'd you say?
7 p.m.
7 p.m. Okay. Okay, great. And let's see. Yeah, that's all I had. Thank you.
Okay. I just one question. When you get the data or the information from utilities, do you get access into their into the system, or is a report or a set of reports provided to you?
At this point, I don't know the answer to that. We can do it either way. The access to the system might enable us to be a little bit more efficient and also not, have to leverage staff time to generate reports, pull supporting documentation. So it's possible that we'll go that route, but we haven't yet had the kickoff meeting with the utilities folks to make that call.
I see. Okay, thank you so much for that. Also, the purchase order task order price that is listed is $84,900, and of which $81,400 is for the utility work order and process review, and the $3,500 is for reimbursable expenses. Just and now, is that have you determined that you will be here?
No. So we need to make that determination in all likelihood. So, Mr. Stone asked about walkthroughs. For walkthroughs, I don't anticipate that we'll need to be here. Ms. Koo, you asked about documentation and really system access, which get that documentation. If for some reason there's a lot of paper documents, I don't anticipate it, we might need to travel. So that's a potential reason to have some contingency budget, so to speak, for travel. And potentially on the back end of this project, we may be in person and we might be able to bring in our experts in to present the final report in person. So there's potential contingency budget there as well for that exercise. The last alternative is simply not to use the travel budget whatsoever, and that would represent one of two things: either cost savings to the city and or additional budget that could be leveraged on other audit activities.
But you will determine that. What is the best course?
We would determine the need to travel. Yes.
Okay.
In all likelihood, we'll know right when we kick off because we'll ask some of the questions you're asking this evening.
Very good. Thank you. I'm done with my questions. Can we get a motion for this action item? I guess I'll move it. I'll move to recommend to approve this task order to conduct a utility work order process and accounting review to council.
Second.
Thank you. Madam Clerk, will you call the vote?
Sorry, I think Leslie may be muted. I'll call the vote interim. Councilmember Tanaka,
Yes.
Councilmember Stone,
Yes.
Chair Koo,
Yes, thank you.
and this motion passed unanimously.
Thank you, Ms. King. Okay, then now we'll go on and proceed to item number 2, Office of the City Auditor, presentation of the IT risk.
Headphones couldn't detect my microphone.
Of the IT risk management assessment report. I know that mute button is very frustrating. Mr. O'Rourke, if you go ahead, thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Ms. Koo. We actually have 2 subject matter experts from Baker Tilly who helped lead this project. I don't believe I'm actually sharing my screen at the moment, so I'll reshare my screen. I'll ask that before we dive in, that those 2 subject matter experts introduce themselves. And then from there, we will kind of jump in and I'll come back, give some introductory information and go from there. First, I'd like to introduce Atit Shah. He is a partner at Baker Tilly. Atit, did you want to offer an introduction?
Sure. Thanks, Kyle. Hi, everyone. As Kyle mentioned, my name is Atit Shah. I'm a partner at Baker Tilly. I lead a lot of our IT and cybersecurity services, especially in the public sector space. So Stacy, who's going to introduce herself next, and I led this engagement working closely with Darren to evaluate the risk management process in place at the city. Stacy, if you want to go next.
Sure. Yep. Hi, everyone. Stacy Gill. I'm a senior manager in our public sector practice here at Baker Tilly. So I work predominantly on various risk advisory related services, a lot of co-sourced and outsourced internal audit, similar to this, and then manage, quite a few IT risk related projects in conjunction with Atit as well. So I served as the project manager on this, and I'll be able to walk us through an overview of the results.
Great, thanks, Stacy. I'll go through the first couple slides and then turn it right back over to you all. Before I jump in, I think what you'll see on this project, and you're going to see this as a recurring theme as we continue to present audit reports, is that we at Baker Tilly want to make sure we're bringing in the best and brightest that we have to offer, the subject matter experts, so to speak, in the various areas that we're taking a look at. I mentioned our utility experts when talking through the task order. So typically in that circumstance, a TEAT or the partner in charge would sort of serve as the quality assurance overview for the project itself. We'd assign a manager as sort of a subject matter expert to lead day-to-day activities. And then I, as the city auditor, am involved in help ensure quality assurance and that the city is kind of well taken care of. And then on the back end of the project, work it through the various channels to make sure we're getting it reviewed and approved. That's kind of the overarching methodology here that we've done. I'll give some introductory information, then turn it back to the subject matter experts. So the next few slides are going to cover these sort of areas. We'll talk about IT risk management. We want to take a step back and describe what is IT risk management, what are we looking at, what does that mean? Then we'll dive into the project background. What were the objectives coming into this? What did we actually do? We'll talk about, I think this should be the analysis section, and then we'll kind of cover sort of questions and your thoughts on the back end. Before we go in, I think we really want to give a big thank you to Darren, as well as the city manager's office and the legal services department for their work on this. But in particular, Darren, was great to work with, very open and honest with us, and really kind of great to work with, and was made available his staff, which was incredibly helpful for this work. So some important considerations before we dive in. The first item on here, you may have seen in Appendix A, and there's a redacted column. So, that redacted information was taken out for a reason, but it gave a little bit of potential for misinterpretation of what wasn't redacted. So the other columns indicated whether or not something was low, moderate, high risk. And I just wanted to let you know that if something is high risk, that's not necessarily an indication that there's an internal control weakness or operating effectiveness issue, but rather there could be inherent risks associated with that category that might lead it to be high risk. So I know there was a news article released last week that might have given the indication that there's some major issues, and a lot of that actually pointed to the appendix, and just wanted to point out that's not necessarily the appropriate way to interpret that information. I'm imagining that you all are going to ask questions that relate to IT security. This was not a cybersecurity assessment, an IT security review. There's elements of that, but I did want to point out that we likely are to recommend, as part of our ongoing risk assessment process and audit planning for next year, some more technical IT work. So this is sort of the overarching risk management, IT risk management review, and then we'll dive deeper into some specific areas as we go. Move forward. I mentioned this, but the redacted information, you all have the unredacted report. I would just caution you maybe to not ask questions or point to some of those items in this discussion today. That information was actually redacted for a reason. Contains internal control specifics that would not be good to publish publicly, so we encourage you not to speak on those items. If necessary, I think we can hold a closed session at council and discuss that further. And then we have some, if indeed this is forwarded to council for approval and consent to during that process, we, this Office of the City Auditor, view that as acceptance of the corrective action plans that are outlined in the appendices. So I just wanted to indicate that not only are you approving the report, ultimately, you're also approving the corrective action plans that go along with it. Now I'll turn it back over to Stacy and Atit, and I'm running the slides, so just let me know when you want me to advance.
All right, thank you. Okay, so yeah, we just wanted to start off kind of defining, what is IT risk management? And IT risk management really encompasses all of the processes, policies, tools, and methods used to manage and mitigate IT-related risks like threats to data confidentiality, integrity and availability, basically those things that if they were to happen, could potentially prevent the city from accomplishing its objectives. So we can really think about, managing IT risk from an operational level, which would include those IT controls that are in place, like let's say, monitoring the successful completion of data backups, or requiring complex passwords, you know, to log into applications, or, you know, providing security awareness training for employees. Those are all kind of things that IT is doing on a day-to-day basis, right? That is helping to mitigate that IT risk. But we can also think about IT risk management from a more holistic level. And that relates to, you know, the things that are being done to actively understand what IT risks exist for the city, and to assess and respond to those risks. So I would say that kind of that holistic level was really the focus for this audit, and kind of what Kyle started to speak to already. So if we go to the next slide, you will see this visual, which basically kind of shows the IT risk management process, or, you know, what a formal risk management process should entail. And this is, you know, based on the ISACA risk IT framework, which we used kind of as the baseline for our review. So there's kind of 5 steps here to the process, which is an ongoing process. The first one, they're setting context, essentially to understand, you know, the city's mission and priorities, since really that's what, you know, will drive, you know, what we consider a risk, and the related impacts of those risks. Secondly, risk identification and assessment. So to compile a register of internal and external IT risks. Thirdly, risk analysis to measure and rate the likelihood and impact of those risks. Fourth is risk response. So, you know, based on the city's risk appetite, deciding how to respond to the risk. So, you know, either implementing mitigation plans, or deciding to accept the risk, or avoiding or trying to share the risk. And then lastly, reporting and communication, which really includes, you know, the monitoring and reporting of risk information to stakeholders, including oversight bodies like yourselves. So if we go on to our next slide, this is just an overview of our project background. You'll see our objectives here. You know, the objectives for this was to really get an understanding of, you know, what are kind of the key risk areas, what are the IT risk management processes that are currently in place, what does that risk management environment look like? And then, you know, we wanted to kind of evaluate the adequacy of those processes, of any frameworks that were being used, and kind of the related internal controls for IT risk management. And then lastly, to offer recommendations for improvement. So as part of our process, kind of a 4-step process here, you know, the first kind of identifying, there's different, you know, frameworks out there as it relates to IT risk management. So we had kind of gone through and tried to select, you know, what we thought would be appropriate for the city to measure against what they currently had in place. The second phase was information gathering. So this is where we conducted, you know, numerous interviews across the different IT functions, again, to sort of understand IT risk management processes, as well as from a high level at an operational level, what controls were in place. And then analysis and testing. So, you know, after kind of understanding what processes were in place, what controls were in place, you know, we were sort of reviewing that against the established frameworks, you know, reviewing documentation where it made sense, to kind of sort of where any potential gaps may be. And then lastly, you know, as we kind of compiled those findings, presented that within the report that you've seen. So our findings and recommendations, I'll just say that, you know, our recommendations were presented in the report and are presented here in the context of that IT risk management visual that you just saw. So, you know, each step in the IT risk management process, steps 1 through 5, kind of correlate with the findings that you see here, where you see step 1, 2, and 3, that's correlating with setting context, risk identification, risk analysis, etc. So, while certain things may have already been in place either informally or to a certain degree, the observations that, we're noting here are really identifying, okay, as part of each of these steps of the expected IT risk management process, here's the things that they don't yet have in place that they should implement if they want to achieve a more formalized IT risk management process. So the first observation that we've noted here relating to kind of setting that context is, there are, strategies and things like that, but, there aren't responsibilities or action plans that have been established or identified. We noted that, there hasn't really been a risk appetite that's been documented or established. There aren't KPIs and metrics to evaluate the achievement of strategic related objectives and outcomes of those IT strategic objectives that were previously outlined. So for this item, again, we just recommend formalization around that. So establishing the risk appetite and tolerances when developing that strategy, implementing, proactive IT risk management process in general, just to be able to ensure that, that you're kind of properly identifying sort of, that those risks that align with your IT strategy and overall city strategy. The second item here, again, this is related to the risk identification and assessment step related to that. So there isn't actually a formal risk identification process in place. So nothing to formally try and identify, from that holistic view, what are all the IT risks out there to compile that into a comprehensive risk register, and conducting sort of that risk assessment process. So that's a recommendation here for that step. For number 3, related to risk analysis. So again, the risk analysis is really kind of taking that risk register, looking at those risks and assessing them to, identify kind of what the likelihood and impact of each would be. And that's sort of the first step in being able to use that to prioritize and understand sort of where your higher risks lie and things to focus on. I think we can go to the second slide. Okay. So step 4, and this is based on risk response. Again, risk response, once you've kind of identified, what risks exist and sort of your highest risk there, making a plan to respond to that. So usually within your risk register that you're maintaining, you would be able to document all of these, related decisions, including how you plan to respond to that. If you plan to implement controls to mitigate that, or if, you're kind of comfortable with the risk level associated with that, you're just going to accept it and not do anything about it. But of course, continue to monitor that. And then lastly, related to reporting and communication, we had just noted that they're really, even outside of, kind of a formal IT risk management process, there really isn't a lot of, I guess, routine communication to oversight committees as it relates to even, cybersecurity risks or IT risks in general. So that's something that, we're recommending be kind of, a standing item that gets communicated, whether within this, oversight committee meeting or another.
Just to add to all these, I mean, I think it's important to note that we're not saying that these things aren't happening. We're saying there should be a formal process to communicate that they're happening with all key stakeholders, get their buy-in, and based on their responses, establish remediation plans or a strategy to close whatever gap or risk that was noted. So in all our discussions with Darren, he's doing a lot of these things already. Our recommendation is that we formalize a methodology and a process to communicate to the council and other stakeholders as well to get buy-in from all stakeholders and establish go-forward plans.
I think now is probably a good time for questions.
Oh, okay. I wasn't finished. I wasn't sure if it was the presentation was finished, but thank you. I think we'll go out to see if there's any members of the public who would like to make comments. Madam Clerk, will you check for me, please?
Yes, ma'am. If any member of the public would like to comment on this item, please use the raise your hand function now. Through the chair, I don't see any requests to speak.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. In that case, we'll come back to council, to the committee. Any questions? Councilmember Tanaka?
I'm still formulating, so you could go, or
Okay.
Councilmember Stone could go, either way.
Would you like to go, Councilmember Stone?
Sure. Yeah, I just have a couple of questions. It was kind of addressed here, but just a little clarifying. I know the report and the presentation stated the city doesn't currently have formal IT risk management practices, but their general day-to-day operational controls to mitigate the IT risks. Are the 5 steps that were delineated in the risk management workflow illustration examples? Sorry, are those examples of formal IT risk management?
Correct.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Step 3 of the risk management overflow recommends that the city develop our own criteria for ranking the risks included in the risk analysis. So is the idea that staff will work in coordination with Mr. O'Rourke's office to develop that criteria based on best practices? Is that what the recommendation is?
It's that, along with determining what your risk appetite is for various IT and cyber issues. So depending on, I mean, you have your own, I guess, utilities, you do parking meters, yeah, you could have PCI considerations, depending on all the different types of potential, I guess, threat vectors and IT risks that are in place or in scope for the city. That would probably determine your risk appetite, and then we would work with you to determine or develop a kind of a risk ranking matrix or register to go with it.
Okay, that's what I was just trying to figure out as far as the process goes. If this is sort of, you then turn it over to the city and then the city's on its own for this, or if there's ongoing collaboration. And thank you. So ongoing collaboration, that's good to hear. And then final question, I know many of the steps in the risk management overflow recommend periodic reevaluation. Are those periodic reevaluations included within the already allocated budget, or will those require additional funding?
So I think you might be referring to something that wasn't meant to refer to internal audit related monitoring, but more that, you know, the IT risk management process is owned by IT, by the city, and that, you know, that's something that the risks that you've got, it's kind of an iterative process, right? It's not something you know, kind of do this risk assessment once and then you just kind of put it on a shelf. So if that's what you're referring to in terms of kind of the monitoring, the ongoing monitoring of risks, that's something that would happen within IT.
Okay, so the recommendation is that the city through internal controls continue to monitor our own practices, not that Baker Tilly would continue to do that. Okay, thank you for that.
It's that, and also like revisiting items on your risk register, because the risk rating could change over time. You could deem something to be a low risk now. There could be a new vulnerability or threat vector that gets introduced into the world and it becomes a high risk item, and then you want to remediate it immediately versus a year from now.
Makes sense. Thank you. Those are all my questions.
Thank you. So I have it might have been answered, but who is going to develop the risk management workflow steps 1 through 5? Is that Mr. Numoto's office, or will that be through consultant? How does that work? Or through you, Mr. O'Rourke's office, and Ms. Gill and Mr. Shaw?
So I see Darren came off mute as well, but ultimately, if I recall correctly, I'm scrolling through quickly. Item number 1 and 5, I think Darren's office is comfortable working through in-house. He's suggesting that to really help formalize the process and conduct essentially what would be the first documentation of the risk assessment, to seek outside consultants to do so. That's sort of my high-level summary. I guess, Darren, would you concur with that?
That's correct. Yeah, we would look at an outside consultant to help develop that risk management framework that makes sense for the city.
And then what is the confidentiality with the outside consultant? Obviously, just like some of the recommendations that were redacted, there's certain confidential matters that should remain within the city. So how is that handled with the consultants?
I see Molly came on camera, but I can start off and Molly can chime in.
Yep.
We would follow the same process we do for all procurements, go through the evaluation of the vendor, sign NDAs as applicable, just as we do with some of our other vendors that manage critical or have access to critical infrastructure or data for the city. So.
Yes, we protect that through our contractual relationship with our vendors.
So it's not so much that what is really confidential to a city is going to be worked on by the city rather than through. So the tasks are separated, where the confidential material is handled by the city and other things is handled by the consultant. It's not done that way.
Not necessarily, right? There are outside consultants and vendors that in various programs and lines of business that we have that do have access and need to have access to confidential information, but we have provisions in our contracts that require them to handle that information in a certain way, keep it confidential, give it back to us when they're done with it, etc.
I see. Thank you. And then see, using the framework, which is the COVID 5. How many of these frameworks are out there? And I realize you looked through it in order to see which one works better for Palo Alto. What is it about COVID 5 that seems to stand out for Palo Alto?
So we like COVID because it's a full enterprise like risk management framework geared towards IT versus, there are a lot of other ones that may be geared towards maybe a small piece of IT. So like ITIL is really focused on like really service desk, service management. There are numerous other ones that are industry specific, but they focus on pieces versus we're looking for a kind of a full IT enterprise-wide framework to implement.
More holistic, as Ms. Gill said, right?
Yep, exactly.
Thank you. Obviously, this is actually, Mr. Numoto and his team has been doing really well throughout the pandemic. They had to kind of rev up and everything in order to make sure that all our departments needing IT use. So it's been a great job that you're doing already. But I do agree that there is a need to formalize and to identify the risks and to have a plan in place. In addition to all of that, there is also the for the public to feel confident that, we are protected here in the city, and that a lot of their personal information that is uploaded into our systems are going to remain safe and not be potentially out to the public, right? Or to hackers and so forth. And with recent hacking and ransoming of some of the nation's assets, that's another thing that we have to kind of keep in mind, which is why thank you so much for this risk assessment report, risk management assessment report. I think I cannot say I really like reading audit reports, but this was actually pretty interesting when I was reading it. So thank you for that. Mr. Tanaka, do you have any questions or comments?
Yeah, thanks for your guys' work on this. Kind of the broad area I was thinking about is, so I think overall it looks pretty good. The part that I was wondering about is kind of when do we do stuff in-house versus outsource? So I know, for instance, like we have our own data center, and I know a lot of government agencies are actually moving to the cloud. One, because it's actually cheaper, and second of all, it's actually a lot more secure or even easier to secure. So I don't know if you guys had thoughts about that, because sometimes it makes sense to do stuff in-house, but sometimes it just doesn't. And I think a data center is probably an example of one of them. I read in there that it looks like it was time to go to a new public safety building, but with the trend of everyone going to the cloud, I just wanted to understand the risk factors involved, and what is the auditor's opinion about this?
So, I mean, honestly, I would defer to Darren on that, on if you've evaluated using SaaS solutions and cloud service providers. In some cases, there is a cost savings, and others there's not. I think transitioning to the cloud will be a significant investment to start with. I know, Darren, I'll let you speak, but the team's pretty lean. So it would be a pretty big undertaking right now. But
No, thank you for that transition. Yes, and we have started leveraging cloud for certain workloads, but the evaluation of what makes sense, and in terms of cost and management, even though you migrate to the cloud, there still is a need to manage that infrastructure, right? Like you migrate to Azure or AWS, you still have to manage the services there as well. And there is a different skill set required to do that. So it is about tooling up, but we have started leveraging the cloud for certain workloads, and we will continue to do so and migrate to whether it be, hosted data centers or SaaS services as needs arise for the city. Again, there is a trend to go more towards SaaS, and we do look there first, but there's also a lot of on-premise, since we have public safety utilities where we have to have on-premise infrastructure to operate some of this environment too. So I see us, definitely managing more towards a hybrid environment. Again, just managing and evaluating what makes sense and when and where to migrate to the cloud.
So what percentage do we have actually on-prem versus cloud right now? Do you know?
Yeah, it's a very high percent is still on-premise, but other applications such as Microsoft is fully cloud-based, and a lot of our other services are cloud-based. Our ERP system is actually hosted in a cloud provider as well. So that's was our first large step towards managing infrastructure in the cloud.
And so what's on-prem?
Just a lot of internal services, from budgeting to just file services to public works, finance, attorney offices, many different servers. We have over 300 actual individual servers we operate and maintain for the city.
Interesting, because usually when you're kind of leaning on the IT side, usually you lean even heavier on the cloud, because there's usually less manpower needed for that versus having to, swap your own disk and your own servers and all that.
There's a lot of that, but there's also a lot of cost. Managed in cloud, it is consumption based. And it's a new model for especially municipalities, because you can't necessarily determine your month-to-month cost, because as your services increase and your usage increases, your cost increase. So there's a lot more management around cost as well. In previous companies, we made decisions to bring stuff back on premise because the cost in the cloud was getting too enormous. So there's a cost to operating in the cloud as well.
Okay. Well, what about the security aspects? Because in the cloud, there's a lot of redundancy. So you kind of if there's an issue with one area, you have backup in the other area. For us, we'd be all kind of all of our eggs in one basket, so to speak, right?
No, we do have enterprise class backup solutions that do store backups offsite. So we are protected in that sense. And similar as cloud services, backups and other services do cost additional dollars. If you want to be geo redundant, if you need, highly available, there's always a cost associated with it. So agree, but there also is a lot more management to that as well. When you start managing those types of environments, like AWS, they just don't automatically manage that for you. You still have to manage the infrastructure. But it is a path we are looking towards. So, we're continually evaluating.
I hear what you're saying, but even on the federal government side, they're looking towards the cloud, right? And you're talking about national defense type of stuff too. So I understand, what you're saying, but I've seen other agencies that, I heard like the NSA, right? Which is, if any agency, you would think they have to be on-prem, right? So I think that's something we should probably think about, right? In terms of cost and security wise, usually there's some advantages there.
Yep, understood.
Okay, and in terms of the audit report, was there any analysis done in terms of like skill set, in terms of what should be done in-house versus outsourced? Because a lot of times some of the IT stuff is very, very specialized, where it's hard to have someone on staff who knows everything. Has any analysis been done around that?
So
we did not. Oh, go ahead, Stacey.
no, I was just going to say, no, that wasn't within the scope of this. I mean, obviously, we kind of had discussions with the different IT functions. So, certain things may have been mentioned in terms of workload, but that was not within the scope of the IT risk management assessment. So not something that we actually reviewed in detail.
Okay. Okay, and how does this compare to other cities that you guys audited?
I'd say it's fairly consistent. I mean, for the size of the city that you guys are, then the size of the IT department, we don't see, I mean, in general, it's less formal. So it's not too far off. But I guess Palo Alto is maybe a more high profile city than others as well. So that may be the difference.
Okay, do you have any more quantifiable than that?
Sorry?
Any other, I get it at a high level, but is there anything more like tangible or more specific that makes you say that?
I mean, obviously universities, some of the tech companies that are in the area, a lot of times they draw potential bad actors to the area that may try to breach your wireless networks, things like that. But I guess from a technical perspective, those are probably the main issues. It's just how the status of the city. So it draws a lot more interest because of who's there, some of your residents, things of that nature. So would like a ransomware attack or something like that could draw more. You could probably gain more from a monetary perspective, targeting residents or citizen data that could be available within the city of Palo Alto versus other cities.
Okay, thank you guys.
Thank you. So with that, if there's no other comments or questions, can we get a motion? In that case, I guess I'll have to do it again then. So we'll recommend to council to accept the IT risk management report and corresponding recommendations for improvement, and recommend to City Council to approve the IT risk management report.
Second.
Thank you. Will the clerk please call the vote?
Committee Member Tanaka,
Yes.
Committee Member Stone,
Yes.
Chair Ku.
Yes.
Motion carries unanimously.
Thank you so much. We'll move to action item number 3, which is review and approve of the Office of the City Auditor annual report. Please go ahead.
Great, thank you so much. Share my screen again. Stacy and Atit, probably no reason for the two of you to stay on, so thank you very much. The last item is indeed the annual report, which will mirror in many ways the quarterly reports you've seen before. A couple of additional items that you haven't previously seen, but overall similar in concept. So just an overview, I include this in every version of the quarterly report, but our contract, which mirrors the requirements of the city audit function, contains 6 tasks. On an annual basis, we conduct a risk assessment, so that's task 1. We put together an audit plan based on the priorities identified in that risk assessment, task 2. Task 3 is sort of serving as the liaison to the financial auditors. And this fiscal year actually will include selection of new financial auditors. Task 4 is execution of the various audit activities, like the IT risk management audit. Task 5 is sort of contains various activities, including quarterly reports, quarterly and annual status reports, also monitoring of the fraud, waste, abuse hotline. And lastly, task 6 is a evaluation and benchmarking of the city audit function. So at the conclusion or near the conclusion of this year, we'll have a peer evaluation done by the Association of Local Government Auditors. Just wanted to recap that, and as we go here, we'll dive deeper into our current status. So some updates. We completed our first risk assessment, which was delivered in March, fully approved in March rather, and we actually are currently kicking off this year's risk assessment. So what you'll see is similar to what we completed last year. It includes really an 18-month outlook, with more of the first 12 months of that 18-month period being more concrete activities, and the last 6 months being items we can potentially defer or reconsider in the following year's risk assessment process. Similarly, we completed our annual audit plan, which was fully approved by council in March. This year, we're working on that as well as we stand right now. In terms of the financial audit, all of the reports were delivered timely last year. As you may recall, there's 5 or so reports that are sort of a financial audit package. We also extended the financial auditors, MGO, for 1 year due to the extraordinary circumstances of COVID and onboarding auditors in a remote work environment sort of being incredibly challenging. That audit is actually underway. So the audit of the FY21 financial statements is currently underway and set for delivery over the coming months. And we actually also have initiated a request for proposals process to identify financial auditors for the coming 3-year period, beginning with the FY22 audit. The net contract will include the option to extend beyond those initial 3 years. Task 4 in terms of our execution of the audit plan. So we have a total of 10 task orders that have been approved since that March timeframe. 9 of those audit activities are currently in progress. 2 have gone through this body. 3 are in draft format and are being routed for final review by Mr. Shikada's office and Ms. Stump's office as well. And then 4 projects are in sort of what I would call the fieldwork phase. We're currently conducting analysis, testing, et cetera, before we ultimately draft reports and make recommendations. The items in bold are things that are happening today. So you reviewed 1 task order today, so there will be an additional task order approved, and we'll kick off that work in the coming weeks. And additionally, you reviewed 1 report today, so that's included in kind of the key activities that have been completed. In terms of our task 5, we've completed all of the required activities there. We monitor the fraud, waste, abuse hotline. We've delivered quarterly reports. We're delivering an annual report today, and this includes other items like attendance of meetings and other administrative items. So of course I personally attend many city council meetings, ELT meeting, executive leadership team meetings with Mr. Shikada on a weekly basis, agenda planning meetings and pre-council meetings that take place weekly as well. And then lastly, we're planning for that peer review that will take place at the end of the year. So that's sort of the high-level overview. In the report you have, the actual written report, I've linked you up to all of these things so you can kind of take a look at what's been accomplished over the past year and look back at some of the reports that have been issued. Getting to reports that have been issued, this is sort of statistics that were on the prior slide, but 2 reports have been issued, fully completed and approved by council, and we have multiple others that are working through that process as well. That bottom paragraph is a little tough to work through, but similar to what I said on the prior slide. So here's the full list of audit activities. The bolded items are in progress and in some sort of status. In the actual report, you can see much more detail. If it's in bold, it could be anywhere from, hey, you approved it today, which is task 4.11, or it could be all the way through the policy and services reporting process. So task 4.4, for example. So a lot of audit activities that are through the life cycle. And again, much more detail in the report itself. Fraud, waste, and abuse hotline. So in the first couple of quarters, we received reports through that hotline. We were able to subsequently close those, investigate and close those. In the past couple of quarters, we have not received any items through fraud, waste, and abuse. So no items to close out. And just to remind you all, when there is an item that comes through that hotline, it goes to a committee which consists of the city auditor, myself, the city manager, and city attorney. If there were any reason where an individual needed to be excused from that process, we would do so. That has not yet happened. This is a unique item that's you'll actually see in quarterly updates moving forward, but it's the first time you're seeing it. So when we took over the Office of the City Auditor, Baker Tilly that is, there have been numerous audits completed over the prior years, and many of the corrective actions or findings and recommendations were not yet remediated. So we went back through over the past several months, really 4 or 5 months, and working with Mr. Shikada and all the various executive leadership team members to work through those observations and identify for the audits conducted in fiscal years 18 through present what findings existed and whether or not they had been closed out through corrective actions during that period. Additionally, you'll see the sort of the status of those remediation efforts and more detail on that in the report. Ultimately, 65% of the findings and the corrective actions have been closed out across that 3-year period. And there are plans in place with timelines to continue to close out the remaining 13 findings over the coming years. What we'll do as the Office of the City Auditor is we'll go back every quarter and essentially ask for status of items that were pending completion during that period. So you can see the timelines laid out in the report and when things are intended to be completed, and we'll go back and each quarter and make sure that those are taking place. I mentioned the 18-month horizon. So for our audit planning process. So if you may recall, there was 3 phases to our audit plan: immediate audit activities to take place 3 to 6 months after approval, and then audit activities that were kind of further out, 6+ months after the completion of the audit planning process. We're at that point where we're kind of reconsidering. We're doing 2 things. We're conducting the next year's risk assessment, which will lay out another 18-month horizon. And as part of that, we want to determine whether or not certain audit activities are still at the top of our priority list. Those audit activities that are sort of under reconsideration are listed on your screen today. If at the end of the risk assessment process, we determine that these are still high priority, we will recommend that we can conduct these audits and move forward sort of as planned. Alternatively, we'll identify other priorities and recommend those tasks in lieu of these. So for example, I mentioned earlier today that we might want to dig into some cybersecurity and IT security risks more deeply. I'm in all likelihood going to make a recommendation that we do that, in which case one or more of these audit activities would be sort of replaced by a cybersecurity assessment, for example. So I just wanted to point out these are the audit activities that have not yet started and potentially might be reconsidered as part of our risk assessment process. And lastly, and I don't have much detail on this in the report, but I've had one-on-one conversations with a few council members, and coming up here in a couple of weeks, we'll have the, I'm not even sure how to describe it, an opportunity for you all to provide feedback on the city auditor's office and myself through the annual review process. So I'm looking forward to that. And really what I want to say is we're seeking opportunities for continuous improvement always in our work. It wouldn't be appropriate for us to be making recommendations of others without seeking opportunities to improve for ourselves. So on your screen right now, you can actually see a few items that we're looking to implement over the next 12 months, really to continue to improve. The first item, and council members, you're aware that we've reconsidered the frequency with which we meet with each of you, and we've retooled our meeting process with each of you. Some of you want to meet with us monthly, some quarterly, so we're making sure we're meeting with you as frequently as you desire and as necessary to complete our work efficiently and effectively. The next item, in some of our conversations with you all, you ask questions, and I want to be better able to respond to those questions. So you're noticing that I'm bringing at least one team member to those meetings. 2 items. That team member has a little bit more capacity to respond quickly to your questions. And also he does so at a lower rate to you all. So it's more cost effective and efficient to have a team member present with me. So that's what you're seeing. So keep the good questions coming, and we'll have our team kind of take a look as we go. You may have seen we had an agenda item on the September policy and services agenda that was ultimately pulled, and that was the IT risk management process. Well, that's indicative of a need to retool the process at the back end of our audit activities to ensure that we give Mr. Shikata and Ms. Stump adequate time to review, and their offices adequate time to review our work and meet with, if necessary, the various stakeholders in the audits. So over the past couple of weeks, we've sort of re-engineered the reporting process to better bring those reports to policy and services and ultimately to council. And lastly, we're reevaluating our council agenda, the Office of the City Auditor's council agenda planning process. Rather than having a 6 to 8 week outlook, we're looking to have more of a 12 to 16 week outlook, which aligns better with the city's agenda planning process and should, again, help us be more efficient and effective. I just wanted to point out some ways in which we're seeking to improve and over the next year. And ultimately, you have the report with you, so happy to answer any questions, but we're seeking your approval and ability to forward that to City Council for consent. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Rourke. If there's any questions or comments, first, I apologize. First, let's check with the public if there's any public comments.
If any member of the public would like to comment on this item, please use the raise your hand function now. Chair Koo, I don't see any requests to speak.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. In that case, we'll go to council members. It's open for questions and comments. Councilmember Stone.
Thank you, Chair Koo. Just a few questions here. So regarding the overtime audit, has the implementation of the processes to track and compare overtime in various departments seen any benefits to the city regarding lowering overtime costs? Or are we too early in the process for that?
So we ultimately didn't look at that outcome. The recommendation was improvement of the reporting and control process, which is what we took a look at, and we verified and validated that those controls were indeed implemented as intended. Not certain if anybody's on the line that can speak to trends in overtime costs.
Well, I think it would be difficult to generalize. We have had a number of legitimate reasons that overtime would be higher than it was prior to any point in time. So given that mixed bag, I think that the city auditor's comment on the audit really focusing on the existence of our controls for accountability and ensuring that overtime is done for appropriate reasons really has been the focus of this work.
So is the hope here to be able to reduce the reliance on overtime? I guess I'm struggling with, like, we know this is an issue. We know it's connected to mostly understaffing, and so just trying to figure out kind of what's the end goal here with the audit overtime.
Well, Kyle, that question may be for you, although again, it predates Baker Tilly's involvement here. Given that, well, heck, I'll go ahead and jump in. I think, to a certain extent, this particular audit was established in the context of the enterprise resource planning system that was being developed at the time. So it was identified as a feature that was of particular interest to be included in the new system. So again, we've gone a different direction with the ERP, and at the same time, the ability to monitor this and ensure appropriate controls has been implemented as a result of that audit.
All right, thank you for that. Let's see, where else was I? So now moving on to the code enforcement audit. And recommendations 1.1 assess regulations that lack of an enforcement process or sufficient resources. And in particular, identified leaf blower regulations as an area that requires special attention. And I think in some ways that was relevant to the recommendation 1.2 to update the municipal code. My understanding of the current municipal code regarding gas-powered leaf blowers, that it penalizes the users of gas-powered leaf blowers and not the property owners. I'm wondering, can staff explain the process if we wish to modify that within the municipal code? What what's the next steps for that?
Yeah, perhaps let me ask Mr. Late for our code enforcement department, but we don't call it that, the Planning and Development Services department, to provide a perspective on the substance of that issue. Then I think we can talk to the process based on that.
Thank you. And so modify it so that one could cite the property owner. Is that what you're, okay. I don't know We've not typically done that because I think our code really on the noise in the noise ordinance section of our code really talks about the operator or the the generator of noise. We could amend the code. It would just be direction from the council to make that amendment, though I think we have it in the form of this, to some degree in the form of the audit recommendations here. It's just getting the ordinance to council to specify more clearly that the city could cite the owner for allowing that type of use to take place. I don't know, and it would require more analysis to determine definitively that we couldn't do it today. I think that's something we'd still need to examine. I think the code suggests that it's intended to go after the one who's holding the leaf blower. But it's just direction to do that, and I'd say the act is relatively simple, but it's among the various things that we're doing, it's how does that get prioritized, and then once we make that change, it's the enforcement component of it, which we are lacking right now, as the council members are aware. So that's the other piece to it.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, yeah, for one, I think we should seriously look into modifying the code that it's penalizing the property owners rather than the owner of the leaf blower. I mean, I think I've talked to a lot of residents who are frustrated with kind of the ongoing lack of enforcement on this issue, and I think maybe a hesitancy from not only maybe residents, but possibly also from the enforcement division as well, to penalize what are frequently more kind of low income workers who are the users of these leaf blowers. And we might be able to see some more some better enforcement and deterrence if we're going after property owners. I think that's an important next step. And then additionally, kind of talking about what you just mentioned as far as code enforcement, and I do think it would be important to discuss in the future whether code enforcement should continue to address these issues or the police department. I don't think it's the proper job for sworn police officers, but maybe it could be done through our community service officers, especially. Correct me if I'm wrong. Our code enforcement team is down to one, so that's not going to be sufficient for effective enforcement on this issue. And I think we all know this really is not just a nuisance issue, which it absolutely is. I empathize with fellow residents who are tired of hearing leaf blowers. I hear it all the time in my apartment complex, but it really is a critical component to achieving our SCAP goals, given really just the incredible amount of emissions caused by single leaf blowers. And I saw two statistics that really just kind of struck out to me. First, a gas-powered leaf blower emits nearly 300 times the amount of air pollutants as a single pickup truck. And also 1 hour using a gas-powered lawnmower is equivalent to emitting as much carbon monoxide as driving a car for over 8 hours. These are really serious implications on our ability to combat climate change. And if we're going to achieve our SCAP goals, this seems to be low-hanging fruit, especially since it's already on the books. We just need to figure out how to better enforce this. So looking forward to that continuing conversation, and hope staff can bring back something as far as a code change, as well as maybe re-examining how we're going to enforce these issues, given our lack of staffing at the moment. So those are all my questions and thoughts. Thank you.
Ms. Chantal.
Just to add on to that, working closely with the Planning and Development Services Department on this, there's also an aspect of just continuing to share information with the community about some of those statistics that you highlighted, Councilmember Stone. For some, it could be a lack of awareness is one of the reasons that they could be participating in the behavior. So just going at it from, I guess, a carrot as well as the enforcement perspective, both being very helpful. So the planning department is thinking through all aspects of that.
You know, and I appreciate that. I appreciate all the work you've been doing on this issue, Ms. Gaines, and I know the community appreciates it as well. But I think this kind of goes back to that issue of who are we penalizing for this ultimately, and you know, even if the public are really educated on how terrible these gas-powered leaf blowers are on the environment, are they then going to do the follow-up to contact their gardener or that company to see what are they using? And that's so disconnected from the penalty if it's not impacting them. And there's just so many layers here that, you know, I think all the education in the world, you know, I don't think is going to address the problem at the end of the day. I think it will come down to enforcement and proper enforcement. So education, always a key component, not saying it's not, but we really need to start addressing that enforcement issue as well. And again, empathize with staff on the lack of staffing on these enforcement issues, but hope we can continue to drive this issue forward. Thank you.
Councilmember Tanaka?
Yeah, thank you for your work on this. A few quick questions. So you spoke a little bit about benchmarking. Can you talk a little bit more about your plans in that area?
Is that a question for me, Mr. Tanaka?
Yeah, slide 17. Task 6.
Oh, so sorry, I had to go back to my slide. Slide 17 was the item that covers our task. Benchmarking actually is the exercise that the peer evaluators will do of the City of Palo Alto's city audit function. So essentially it will be the benchmarking and peer evaluation of the city auditor's office.
Okay. Is there any benchmarking going on between, let's say, our city and another city?
Running through audit activities in my mind, I think no tasks are specifically geared towards benchmarking. I think on a couple of audit activities, there are elements of benchmarking. For example, on the building permit process review, we're looking at, to the best of our abilities, how the permitting process in Palo Alto compares to that of other cities, and looking at benchmarking sort of cycle times. Additionally, and this is not necessarily quantitative, but more qualitative benchmarking on the nonprofit agreement risk management review, we're looking at how the city's process for engaging with nonprofit entities compares to other cities, as well as elements of the agreements themselves.
Okay. Well, anyways, I think you know, it's hard to tell whether something is good or bad by itself. I mean, you can usually tell when you look at relative to something else. So definitely want to encourage your team and trying to do some benchmarking as much as you can. I would love to see that as part of the work plan, and you know, either in this plan or future plans. And because I think by doing that, we could also understand what our best practices, you know, areas we're strong in, areas where we can, right? I think it helps inform everyone. You know, one thing that the city manager has done, and he spoke a little bit about it a couple of weeks ago, and I got to commend him for doing this, is he's started to push out net promoter scores. So I think that's actually a really good step forward. And I think we should use that data, you know, to see how things are going. I don't know whether if you have access to it, but if not, I think the city manager should give you access to that, so that you know, it's another tool. And I think the best organizations actually incorporate kind of like real-time feedback, continuous real-time feedback. So I think that's something that you know, we could look at as a way to measure our progress in terms of, I think especially in terms of like customer service, right? Because if you look at like Yelp reviews, you know, sometimes there's not you know, not the most flattering thing said sometimes. So, and I think it's good for us to kind of get more real-time feedback at a time that services are rendered. So it's very common is what happens in the private sector. So anyways, I want to encourage you guys to do that as well, to get involved in that somehow. I don't know if the other cities you work with are using NPS, but if they are, it'd be a great way to kind of see how we're doing and get some benchmarks going.
I don't believe I work with any other cities, but I'll request that information from the team. We are definitely looking at customer service information related to the building and permit process. So we will be, to the extent that that information is available, doing some analysis and including that in our report.
Okay. Yeah, I think, we're a customer service organization. So I think, that's why I think that kind of feedback is really important. And it's one of the key and early indicators as to how things are going. I think by times we hear, like, from as council members, it's like sometimes something has really boiled over, right? So it's better to hear it at the time services are rendered versus by the time we hear it at city council. So you mentioned also about work around utilities, right? Risk on utilities. And are you also looking at, because, a lot of times with fluctuating commodity prices, some utilities will actually hedge, right, and use derivatives. Are you going to be able to do any kind of recommendations in that area?
We don't have that on our audit plan, so we don't have planned activities around that. However, more than willing to chat through it and consider it for the upcoming audit plan. I would imagine I don't know if I'm going to make an unfair statement. I would imagine that's something that you could ask of staff in a subsequent meeting to report on practices around hedging and sort of best practices in managing commodity prices. But certainly we as the city auditors can consider it for a forthcoming audit activity.
Okay. I just wanted to comment on Councilmember Stone in regards to the leaf blowers and mowers and stuff. So I also agree that I don't necessarily like the gas powered leaf blowers or mowers. In fact, I don't think anyone really does. And in fact, I read that California might be banning them or banning the sale of them or something like that. So which I think in general would be a good thing. But I don't actually agree with finding the homeowners, because I think one issue is that a lot of homeowners aren't home when the gardeners are there. And so it's actually really tough to know, it's really hard for the homeowners to measure compliance, because I know I, for one, for instance, contractually told my gardener, you do not use a gas powered or mower or leaf blower, but I may not actually be home to actually make sure that's happening. So I don't know whether that's trying to ask the homeowner to police this, which can be very difficult for a lot that aren't actually home when the gardeners are there. So one last thing for you, the auditor. So how do you think, from the city council point of view, how can we help you to become more effective? Where are areas that you need help or support in?
I think the most immediate is our next risk assessment process. So in this meeting today, you've mentioned a couple things that you'd like to consider for audit activities. I think providing that candid feedback in our one-on-one sessions would be helpful. And if there's instances where you might be receiving complaints, hearing things in the public, doing known independent research, anytime you can provide more than simply telling us what you're hearing is beneficial to us. So if you're doing independent research, you're seeing practices that other cities are implementing and want us to take a look, we'd be happy to consider that. I think that's the most immediate and beneficial for us.
Okay. Well, I think I've told you a lot already, but I think some that might, if you're looking for extra work, right? I think one might be, I've heard, I think a councilman said, oh, the crime's way down, but I've also saw the crime's up. So it's kind of like, is it up or is it down? I think that would be interesting, right? Like, are there more, thefts or fires or burglaries or whatnot? Like, how's that looking? We have a report, but it's kind of like, how is it in context to all the other cities that surround us? And then I think the other thing would be, and it's something I spoke about with the city manager last Friday, was RV, or not, I guess not RV, but the 72-hour enforcement, right? I think that would be just in terms of how are we doing in terms of our enforcement or of our ordinances. So that's the other thing that would be interesting. So those are two I could think of off the top of my head. Okay, thank you.
Did you want to say something, Mr. Rourke?
No, I said, okay, I'm quickly making note of those last items before I forget.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the report. I just have a couple of questions. You answered my question about the FY 2022 audit activities, and you said those are some of the priorities that was identified, but it could possibly change. So thank you for that. I wanted to ask, when you close out your audit activities, your office still continues to monitor the corrective items and evaluate them, whether they're working or maybe the corrective actions need to be reevaluated also?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. So for example, the IT risk management report included a series of recommendations. Those will literally get added to the database. So we have a tracking tool. It's exactly what you see in the appendix for the most part. And then we periodically follow up. Essentially, once a quarter, we take a look and determine whether or not the timeline agreed to by staff would indicate that it should have been completed or is on the horizon. And for those items, we'll follow up with city staff to determine whether or not those corrective actions have been implemented. And where necessary, we'll validate. So we might do a small sample. We might, if it's implementing a monthly report or something like that, we'll ask for examples of those. And where we're able to determine the corrective actions have indeed been implemented, we'll close them out, so to speak. They'll be on our tracker forever, but we won't continuously follow up necessarily if we've determined that the corrective actions have indeed been implemented. Sorry, my long-winded answer.
No. Thank you so much. On your nonprofit agreement risk management review, right? It says there's a fieldwork phase. Are you conducting the fieldwork in person, or is that how are you meeting up with the nonprofits in order to gather your information or to ask your questions?
All of that work is being done remotely.
Okay.
So we've requested a number of agreements. We've conducted some sort of process walkthroughs and asked questions to understand those agreements. All of those types of activities have been conducted remotely.
I see. And so it's actually more talking with staff and discussing with staff versus actually going to the nonprofits for the discussion.
That's correct. So we're looking mostly at the process to engage with nonprofits and how those nonprofit agreements are monitored over time. So it's mostly discussions with staff, reviewing existing documented policies and procedures, and reviewing the agreements themselves and any deliverables that might be associated with those agreements.
Okay, thank you. So on code enforcement, I think the council members have mentioned that they interact and they hear from residents what are some of the impacts that they're experiencing. So will the auditor's office be reaching out to some of these community stakeholders, businesses, and residents for feedback on some of the code enforcement items?
We don't plan to.
You don't plan to.
But rather so I will say, if you look at all of those recommendations and corrective actions, all of them are on hold, largely due to the capacity of the code enforcement function. But when we do our follow-up, we don't or wouldn't typically interact with the public, but rather look at the practices or procedures that are implemented by city staff to remediate those the audit recommendations.
So when you get feedback, it's going to be mostly coming from council members and staff?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the report, and if someone would like to make a motion to move this to recommend for council approval.
Yeah, I'll move we forward the city auditor's annual report to council for their approval.
I'll second it.
Thank you. Madam Clerk, will you call the vote?
Yes, ma'am. Committee Member Tanaka,
Yes.
Committee Member Stone,
Yes.
Chair Ku.
Yes.
Motion
thank you.
carries unanimously.
And Mr. O'Rourke, thank you for the reports today and all the tremendous work
Thank
you've
you.
been doing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Cotton Gaines, I think we move to future meetings and agendas.
Yes, so for November and December, I will need to have a follow-up with Chair Ku, but the items that we do have pending for the committee are priority setting for the annual city council retreat, the legislative guidelines agenda, and also having some sort of touch base related to the protocols and procedures document. We have the quarterly update on race and equity work, as well as the council referral for the community ambassador program and the council referral for the affordable housing funding. So where exactly we list those things for which meeting, Chair Ku and I will need to follow up on, but I did want to let you all know that those items are pending. And then also I wanted to mention to the committee, I know that many of the other council committees are starting at 6 p.m. I didn't know if that was something that was of interest to this committee or not for us to try a 6 p.m. start time instead of a 7 p.m. But I did want to mention it here in case there was a desire for that.
I don't prefer that.
I don't mind that.
I would note on behalf of staff, many of whom start their days at 7 or 8 a.m., that starting at 7 p.m. guarantees a 12-hour day. But such as it is, certainly open to council's feedback on this.
If it's easier on staff, I'm fine with a 6 p.m. start.
And if there's no other comments, Ms. Cotton Gaines, we're done.
Yep, that's it. I'll work with the city clerk for the start time for the next meeting.
Okay, and with that, we're adjourned. Thank you very much, and good night.